Well, hello, Justin.
Well, howdy. Man.
Hey, Justin.
Hey, Jason.
We're starting the last chapter of John tonight.
I know, as we
So, sometime about mid-April.
probably
We'll
we'll be out of John.
when we
now.
wrap up John. No. So, I predict within a solid, another week or two after tonight, we'll be wrapping that up. Where are we going next?
Well, I've decided we're going to go to Second Opinions, and we're going to read there all of my great opinions.
All right. So, second, okay, but I get first opinions then if you're going to second opinions.
I think we're going to the book of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
There you go, a.k.a. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, wasn't it?
We're going to the book of Belshazzar.
Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus, Darius, Artaxerxes, and Daniel.
Belshazzar, yeah.
There we go.
We've renamed it Belshazzar,
Okay.
so we're going to be studying the book of Belshazzar.
All right. We have already kind of a little bit started looking at some notes for Daniel, and we'll see how that goes. We'll see if you think we can get it? There's 12 chapters. You think we can get it done in 12 weeks?
I don't know.
No.
Some of them are. Well, we could get through some of them, maybe.
Maybe. All right.
but-
Okay. We'll see what we can do. Well, John 21 won't start itself unless we start it here. You ready to go?
Let's do it.
Okay. Hey, I put in some. We haven't seen these slides in a while.
Woohoo!
I figured in time for us to. We kind of tried to refer back to a couple of these last week, and we both got stumped. So I thought maybe it was a good time for us to review some of those big points that we've talked about in John. So the 7 signs, water to wine in chapter 2. Nobleman's son is sick in chapter 4. That's the 4 S's right there, isn't it?
Yeah.
Nobleman's son is sick. Okay, so if you say it right, there's 4 S's. There's an invalid in Bethesda, and V is the Roman numeral 5, so that helps you remember it's in chapter 5. And then feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus, so 5,000 plus 5 plus 1 is 6, that's chapter 6. That one stretches it, but that's okay. They just got to help you remember. They don't have to make sense for you to help you remember things, which is probably good for us. And then chapter number 5, walking on water, and if you crane your head sideways one direction, those W's look like 3s.
And this is sign language for W, so
What is it?
Yes.
Okay, that's probably more helpful than the.
Well, I'm
okay.
trying to pick a font that looked close enough,
Okay,
but anyways,
I didn't
yeah.
know that. All right, so you wait till now to bust that out on us. All
Well,
right.
hey, I mean, it's
Okay.
got to build and build. There's got to
All
be
right.
crescendo here.
So walking on water is chapter 6. The blind can see, and the C with the exclamation point looks somewhat like a 9. Okay, that's kind of the thing there. And then Lazarus alive again. So L and L is 11. And there you go. So I like the mnemonics and trying to help us remember what chapters those are in. That's helpful. Excuse me. And then we also had the 7 I am statements. We don't have any handy-dandy mnemonics for those. That kind of stumped us. So I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life, and I am the true vine. So Jesus makes those 7 I am declarations about himself. And really a great study. I think a great study for a young preacher to do a series of sermons on sometime, maybe.
Well, maybe.
Yeah, so that's a good thing. Everybody ought to have that series in their back pocket if they're a preacher. Okay, well, we're ready to jump into chapter 21, and we'll take the first 8 verses. A quick recap. In chapter 20 was the resurrection. And so Jesus, Mary, in the book of John, it's presented as Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early in the morning and got there, and the stone was rolled away, and nobody was there, and she ran and told the disciples. And, first she was... Now I'm out of order. She ran and told the disciples that he wasn't there, and Peter and John ran in and saw the linen cloth lying there, and then they left, and then Mary peeked back in the tomb and saw the two angels. And, she was distraught because the Lord was not there. And then when Jesus spoke to her, she didn't at first realize who it was, and then she did realize, and she went and told the disciples that Jesus was risen. And so then Jesus presents himself over a couple of different occasions to the disciples, to the apostles, first without Thomas and then with Thomas, so that Thomas could make his declaration. So that's chapter 20, and we're ready now for kind of John's final recording of Jesus' post-resurrection appearance. So verses 1 through 8. After these things, Jesus manifested himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and he manifested himself in this way. Simon Peter and Thomas called Didymus and Nathanael of Cana in Galilee and the sons of Zebedee and two others of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, "I am going fishing." They said to him, "We will also come with you." They went out, got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. But when the day was now breaking, Jesus stood on the beach, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. So Jesus said to them, "Children, you do not have any fish, do you?" They answered him, "No." And he said to them, "Cast the net on the right-hand side of the boat, and you will find a catch." So they cast, and when they were not able to haul it in because of the great number of fish. Therefore, that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." So when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put his outer garment on, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. But the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards away, dragging the net full of fish.
So I have two slides here. I'm going to trip you up. Two
Oh, boy.
slides before
Okay.
we get to but this one's going to be fast.
Okay.
Brief snapshot here. So the question that I wanted to ask before we get into John 21 too far is why John 21? I mean, the end of John 20 sounds like a strong finish to the book. It's strong. I mean, it's a thesis. It's the ending. These are written so you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. What a great ending that could have been. But John doesn't end there. And so I wanted to ask, what... And again, this is more, kind of rhetorical, but the 2 points that I wanted to make is that Jesus is a great Savior and John is a great friend. Jesus is a great Savior because without John 21, and again, obviously we have it, I don't know what you want to call that, organized for us in Scripture the way that it is. It is likely that John is one of the last gospel writers to write. And this story with Jesus on the lake and then coming home and coming off the shore is not recorded in any of the other Gospels.
Right.
And so up until this point in the text, all we have of Peter is this brash fella that ultimately denied Jesus 3 times. And at the end, he denied Jesus 3 times. And then in Luke, at the end of Luke's Gospel, it will say that Jesus has appeared to us and to Simon Peter. In Luke chapter, I believe it's Luke 24, will nod at the fact that Peter and Jesus have met after that. But up until this point, there is no reinstatement of Peter. We go from Peter denying them to, again, Jesus being resurrected and having that meeting, but we don't have any idea what happened at that meeting. We have any idea of what was specifically going on, specifically with Peter, and then we have the book of Acts. And it's, again, likely the book of Acts was written before John, and so again, it wasn't organized in this fashion yet. But in our Bible, if we had John 20 and Acts 1, we would kind of wonder what happened to Peter. What was going on with Peter? Because he's been denying Jesus. In Luke, we would have the idea that Jesus met with him for a little bit. And then on Acts chapter 2, obviously he's there at Acts 1, the ascension, they choose Matthias. Acts 2, we see Peter preaching this great sermon. So how does Peter get from denying Jesus to, yes, having some background talks with Jesus to being the great preacher on the day of Pentecost? And I think John 21 is the answer. John 21 is the reason. John 21 is one of the greatest times when Jesus, again, it's called the reinstatement, referred to as the reinstatement of Peter. Peter is in the midst of his failure, and Jesus doesn't leave him there. Jesus comes for him. Jesus is a great Savior, and John is a great friend. He records this so that we may know that Peter was loved by Jesus. Again,
Yeah.
John calls himself, I'm the disciple Jesus loved. I think everyone else could also claim that. But I don't know if John had a special relationship with, anyways, John calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved, but Peter was the same way. It was a disciple whom Jesus loved, and he was a great preacher for the mission. Again, you'll see that Peter will have some more struggles down the road. Paul and Peter will be knocking heads. Galatians 2, when Peter was mistreating some of the Gentiles because his Jewish brothers showed up. But Peter, after denying Jesus, is still a great apostle and a great preacher and a great great worker for Jesus. So John 21 is really, to me, not necessarily Peter is the main focus of all of it, but John is recording this so that we can understand that we can look back. Well, and again, there's another detail. When John is writing, it's likely Peter's been dead for many years. John is writing at the end of the first, again, likely at the end of the first century, based on he's exiled to Patmos. It's likely that he wrote his gospel a couple years, if not at the same time. And so he is likely the last gospel writer writing when probably Peter is dead by now. And so he's looking back on this time, looking back on this life, and that will get even more, in verse 19, will show us a little bit of that. But why John 21? It's really about how Jesus and Peter are going to be reuniting, and I think it's a great message. It's a great example for us to follow as well of how we. Anyways, we'll get there in a minute.
Yeah, and I think you're right, and it's almost like it's not the last chapter of John, but the first chapter of the rest of the story, because you've got what are Peter and James and John doing when Jesus first meets them? Yeah, when Jesus first meets them, they're fishermen. And what does he do? He calls them out of that life into a new life. And now we're kind of in this limbo, this transition period where Jesus died, and yes, he's been resurrected, but everything has changed. The plans that we thought we had in place for what our future with Jesus was supposed to look like don't look that way anymore, but we don't know what they look like. And so what do? They go back to what feels comfortable. I mean, Peter's going back to fishing. Is he thinking, I guess I'm going back to a life of fishing, or is this just like, hey, we've got a day off, let's go fishing for fun, or it doesn't feel that way. It feels like, we got to think about how we're going to go from this day forward. And so Jesus calls him right back out of that life once again. I mean, I'm looking for a math word and I can't think of it. A symmetry here with the beginning of the book and the end of the book, with the beginning of their ministry, with the next phase of their ministry, how Jesus is calling them out of the life they thought they knew into the life that he has planned for them, and they're going to follow. They don't really know what they didn't know what that meant the first time, and it took them places they never thought they'd go, and now here it is. They're feeling kind of lost again, and Jesus is going to call them out of that life. And they don't really know where it's going to go, but they're going to follow where he leads. And so I think it's an appropriate way to move that story forward. Good job, John, is what I'm saying. Yeah. All right. So I think that's a neat way of kind of characterizing it there, that this doesn't feel like the last chapter of John. It feels like the first chapter of Acts almost, or the first chapter of the rest of the story.
So I had a couple different quotes, if you will. I think I underlined and bolded and highlighted different things throughout the text as we read it. But we see Peter a natural leader in this situation. A natural leader, I mean, he just says, I'm going fishing, and the rest of them say, okay, we'll go with you. Now, I wanted to look at this in two different ways. One of them, we'll put this way. One way we can look at it, and again, this is more just looking at it from our lens of what we can what we can gather from the text, is I think there's a point to be made, and again, this is more a point that kind of applies to the text, not necessarily one that's from the text. But this idea is that, again, at the bottom of the screen up there, it says Luke chapter 5, that this is something that Jesus has done before. He's said, cast your nets in the side, and they caught a bunch of fish. And that's one of the ways that John will say, hey, I know this is the Lord. Because in Luke chapter 5, this is when he first called them. Jesus was trying to preach. He gets in the boat. They go out on the water. He's preaching to a crowd. And then he tells the fishermen, who are currently fishermen at the time, he says, cast your nets. They said, we've caught nothing all night. And again, that's getting into some of my other points in there. But Jesus, the preacher, says, all right, just cast them one more time. And the expert fishermen say, I don't know why. I don't know what's going on here, but we're going to do it again. And they do it again, and they catch a whole bunch of fish. But John is going fishing. Or not John. Peter's going fishing, and the rest go with him. And on one hand, I've heard lessons said, well, that Peter shouldn't have done this. Peter should not have gone fishing. He is instead of looking for the Lord, he is going back to what his life was like before Christ. Now, I don't necessarily think that's what Peter was specifically thinking of. Well, Jesus is gone. I'm abandoning ship on that. I'm just going to go back to what I know. I'm going to go back to what's comfortable. The rest of my life is going to be a life of a fisherman. I don't think that's what he's going for. I think that he's, the second point, we'll get to that. I think that's really what he's after. But the first point is still somewhat applicable to our lives, that what we were doing before we became Christians is not necessarily something that we should go back to all of the time. That if what we were doing before Christ was not something that was God-honoring, and now that we're in Christ, now that we've have this relationship with Him, there are some things we don't go back and do again. If God, again, now some people will take this a step farther and say, well, if God has called you to the mission field and you decide to go back home, well, you shouldn't do that because you're turning your back on what God has called for your life. And if God has a calling for you and you turn your back on that, then this is where that breaks down, and I don't really follow all of that. But there are things that we don't do once we've met with Christ. John or Peter has gone throughout his 3-year ministry with Jesus. He's gone through the death of Jesus. He's gone through the resurrection of Jesus. He has met Jesus a couple different times. Once by himself, according to Luke, and then a couple different times again with all the disciples there. And I don't think Peter is returning to his old life, giving up on Jesus. But sometimes that's what, as Christians, we can do. We can turn our back on God to go back to what's comfortable, to go back to what's the way that I was before. When God is calling us to something different. God is calling us to be light. God is calling us to be salt. Paul will say, don't walk in the things in which you once walked. You've called out of those things. Live differently. And again, I don't think it's go back to your old profession is wrong. But when we turn back to the things that we were doing before Christ that are not God-honoring, we need to wake up and have a healthy dose of come to Jesus moment.
Good way to put it.
Yeah, so anyways, number one, that's one way of looking. He's returning to what he was doing. He was returning to what's comfortable. He's returning to his comfort zone, and that can be a bad thing sometimes for Christians if we return to that, and it's not God-honoring.
So a question, first
Yes.
of all, texted in from a question texted. Where'd it go? How did I get all the way there? Without Jesus, did the disciples have any income, and did they need money from the fishing? So how did they earn money while they were following Jesus in the first place?
Well,
I don't know that we know that. I don't know that we know the answer to that question. And is it, huh? Well, I mean, they had to eat. But yeah, they had benefactors.
And if they got hungry, Jesus made food.
5,000. Yeah, there you go. It is. And so, and I think I mean, where my thought goes with that is how, I mean, for the last 3 years-ish, they've been with Jesus basically all the time, right? I mean, Jesus has at times sent them out. He has undoubtedly had times when he was with some, and we know there were occasions when certain disciples were with them and certain disciples were absent from various scenarios or whatever. But basically, during the course of that 3 years, they're with Jesus all the time. And so it seems like during this window of time after the resurrection that Jesus kind of comes and goes. He's there, then he's not. He's there, then he's not. We don't know when he's coming. I mean, we don't know when he's coming back. He was here, we were gathered in the upper room, and all of a sudden he was there, and then all of a sudden he was gone. And we don't know when he's coming back. So what do we do while we're waiting? And you might be getting to that right now, but based on what I see there next. But I mean, is it? I don't think he's just killing time. And I agree, I don't think he's like abandoning the life that he feels like he's been called to go back to it, just to resign from that life and go back to a previous life. But he is returning back to what he knows how to do, the life that he lived before he ever heard of Jesus. And so there's something to that. And then I lost it. It was gone. It was there. It's going to be brilliant. It's going to be the best thing I said all night, but I can't remember what it was. There you go.
Well, all right.
Take it and run with it.
So I think again, combining all of that together, I mean, the next point up there that I've read, that I've heard different people talk about, is that this is another a different way, a different light of looking at this. This is instead of passively waiting around on the Lord, and then drawing a comparison with us and kind of mirroring and paralleling this, is that we're in that state as well. We're waiting on the Lord. The Lord is going to return. He said any day that I could come like a thief in the night, and as I wouldn't say a word against, but there are some that would say, well, the Lord is coming, and he's coming in a couple of weeks or a couple of years or a couple of months. And so because he's coming back soon, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to sell everything I have and live, and just do nothing until God comes, because I'm waiting on the Lord. And again, there are different times throughout history where it's like, okay, we see the events in Revelation that we can point to. This is the end times. This is the time when Jesus is going to come. I know I'm a part of this is when all of this is happening. And they say, well, God is coming so soon. The Lord is coming back. In a couple of years, he's going to be here. And I think what the disciples are doing is they're in this state where, Jesus has said in Matthew 28, he sent word to them, go into a mountain and I'll teach you there. And that's when he gives the Great Commission. And then after that, he will ascend in different times at another time. And so, there are times, again, as Jason was saying, he's appearing and he's not. They don't necessarily know when the Lord is going to be there. They don't necessarily know where they're supposed to be. I don't think Jesus was saying, well, be there at this time. And so they're like, well, we got a day to kill. Let's go fishing. I think that Peter was actively waiting on the Lord. He was saying, I'm waiting, O Lord. I am here. I am ready. I am going to be doing the mission, the work that you've called me to do. But while I have this time where I don't really know what's going on, I'm going to go find something to do. There's a difference between actively waiting and passively waiting. And he says, I am going to go fishing. He jumps out there, and I think, again, combining everything that I can remember from Scripture. Peter has a mother-in-law. So his mother-in-law's got a house, and they go to Peter's mother-in-law house after he gets out of prison. And so maybe that's one of the houses they went to, and it said they went to their own homes. John is now tasked with caring for Jesus' mother. And so, how is he doing that? How is he providing for them? There are different snippets of information that we have where there are wealthy people supporting them, funding them, helping them out with the daily necessity. But another interesting thing is, where do they get these boats and these nets? I mean, are there their boats and nets that they left there? Are they go and rent one? Is there a rent-a-boat there? I mean, is there a U-Haul for boats somewhere? I mean, I don't know. But they find a boat, they find a net, they go fishing. And I think that it was a good thing for them to be proactive. Again, maybe Peter just got real hungry and said, I'm hungry, I'm going fishing. Or maybe he thought, we need a bunch of money, so we need to do the work of the Lord now. Jesus has, been resurrected, and he is going to give us his great commission here in just a little bit. He tells us to meet him here. We don't want to go empty-handed, so we want to have some fish, some money, some support to get there, to be prepared for what he's going to have us do. Again, most of that is speculation, but the idea is Peter decides that he wants to go fishing. And whether that's good or a bad thing on Peter's part, I do think that it was a benefit to them and to the rest. And all of the disciples go with him. They just said, okay, let's do it. So Peter decides to go fishing, and he does. And he goes fishing. They go fishing, and they go out all night. So most of the time, the best fishing was likely at night from historical records, that you'd go out there and you'd light torches on the water, and the fish, attracted to the light, they'd come to your boat, you'd throw your net out, you catch a whole bunch of them, you bring them back in, and then you'd have fresh fish for the morning at that market. The fish weren't stale, they weren't sitting there since yesterday's cast. It's fresh fish that they caught early that morning. And there's even, you go to different places close to the coastline, you get fresh fish caught this morning. And so they go out, they try to catch some fish, but they caught nothing. but they caught nothing. I wouldn't say the rest of, a lot of my points tonight are going to contain some Greek. But I looked it up in the Greek, and the word nothing means nothing. There was zero, not a zilch. They didn't catch a single thing. It's this many. So their nets were empty. They had nothing to eat. And Jesus, as the day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore. Yet the disciples did not know it was him. There's many times Jesus shows up, and they don't know it's him. Now, we aren't told exactly specifically why that is, but they don't know it's him. And maybe let's give him some slack. It's the early morning. I know I can barely see the cows when I'm out there, at daybreak going, is that one having a calf? Well, I can't even see the cow anymore. So maybe they just couldn't see very good. It's as the morning is breaking, as the day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore.
And they're about 100 yards away, it says later on. And I can't see 100 yards to know who's over there yelling at me from across the way. So...
Yeah, well, and again, another random physics thing about Scripture is that voices can carry that far on water. I mean, it wouldn't have been, he probably would have had to, I don't know if Jesus was shouting, but they definitely could have heard and understood him at that distance. But Jesus says, children, what a fun, usually you think of fishermen as gruff men out there doing their work, and they're casting nets, and they've been sweating and pulling these nets in, and they didn't have a nice cage with a winch on it. They had to lower it down in there and pull it back out. And he says, hey, you fellas over there, you children. And in, I don't know what version we have on the board, but I think it's the New American Standard says, you do not have any fish, do you? Because, again, getting into some of the Greek, he asks a rhetorical question, kind of, because he already gives the answer. In Greek, the no, if you will, is the way they put it. It's the no in the question automatically assumes that your answer is going to be no. And so it's, do you not have any fish? Do you? Because I know you don't, and that's how they translate it into English. I know the answer is no, and so there's a little bit of a sarcastic flair to the idea of how you translate that into English is, well, I know you don't, do you? But Jesus asks this question knowing they have nothing. Knowing there's nothing in their net, there's nothing in their boat, they have nothing to eat. Interestingly enough, we'll get into this a little bit. This word here for fish is not actually fish. The word here is, there's lots of hapax legomena, which is a fancy way of saying it only appears one time in Scripture. And so we don't have lots of other times where we can say, this Greek word was used here and in Philippians 2 and in, Colossians 1, and each time it's, the singing verb, and so we know it's singing, but this is used one time, and some of the lexicons would translate this as something to eat alongside my bread. Do you have anything to eat alongside the bread? Not necessarily fish, meaning did you catch anything to eat with bread, but it's not a word for fish, and that gets somewhat more important later. I think it's just a funny, interesting thought, because here John is going to use three different words for fish. John says, or Peter says, I am going fishing, which is a Greek verb. It's aleun. Anyways, hard to pronounce. It's a whole bunch of vowels back to back. But I'm going to fish, to catch something in the water. He uses this word here. It's hard to say. Prophagoin, I think. Prophagoin. I typed it in English, so I don't have the actual way of remembering. Anyways, the correct pronunciation. But it's only used here, prophagoin, and it's like, do you have anything to eat with my bread? Which, interestingly enough, they just translate it into fish in English. And then later on, he's going to use the word, and I love saying this one, it's opsarion. Opsarion. Or, the A can make different sounds, but it's opsarion. And it means a little tiny fish. Just a little fish, like a little tiny fish. And so he will use that word later. So John is essentially flexing his vocabulary, saying, I know how to call a lot of things that are fish. I'm a fisherman, is what he's going to try to say here. I'm a fisherman. I understand fishing. I know what that's like. I know there are words for fish that I know a bunch of them. When he talks about this fishing, he says that let's see here. Well, I think it's in the next deal here. The net was not torn from verse 11. He's a fisherman. He knows that he is astounded at the fact that they caught so many fish, yet the net didn't break. There's lots of times they're mending their nets in Scripture because their nets broke all the time. Yes, with such a big cast, their nets don't break. And so John is, I think what he's trying to do is he's saying, I'm a fisherman. I know fish. I know what's going on with these fish. And this is just an interesting weird flex of vocabulary usage here when he says all these things. Anyways, my point there with number 2 was they caught nothing, and Jesus knew they caught nothing. And yet Jesus still asks them a question. Jesus wants them to acknowledge and recognize the fact that they do not have anything. Their failure at catching fish that night was what Jesus was highlighting. He was saying, are you guys a bunch of failures? Did you succeed in your task? And again, not being as harsh necessarily as that. In our English language, there's a lot of pressure on that. But the idea is you didn't succeed at your task. You went out there to catch fish. You've been trying all night, and you did not succeed. And this carpenter, a workman, just a normal craftsperson, the preacher, again from Luke 5, he's out there preaching on the water, gives the master, the expert fisherman, gives the masters the fishing advice. Hey, the boat is likely anywhere from about 7 to 8 feet from one side of the boat to the other. They've been throwing their nets out on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, that's how they do it all night. And so saying, hey, just try it one more time on this random side, it's like, okay, we've been doing that all night. What do you think? We've just been throwing it on the left all the time, and we've just left this entire body of water over here just completely, we've left it alone. But he says, cast it over there. So they cast it, and they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. And I think one of the points here is, if you guys, as my disciples, are going to go out in the world, and you're going to try to catch fish, and again, if you use the representation of Luke 5, if you're going to try to catch men, because I'm going to make you fishers of men, and if you go out there, and I think this is applicable to us too, if you're going to go out there and try to catch fish, try to catch men, and try to draw them in to following the Lord, and yet you're going to do it on your own power, on your own steam, with your own way of doing things, with your own, if you're going to do it without Jesus, your effort means nothing. There will be no success. There will be nothing that comes about because of it. Because if you're going to, again, maybe this is a little bit of a stretch, as fishers of men now, they've been called fishers of men. If you're going to be a fisher of men and you can catch nothing by yourself, yet everything with Jesus, and you can catch 153, he's going to say in a little bit. They counted them. They numbered them, maybe one by one, counted their blessings. But they numbered the fish, 153. If you can catch 153 with Jesus and yet none without him, I think that's a parallel to what's going to happen on the day of Pentecost. With Jesus, with the Spirit, with the power that God has available, things are going to happen. But if you're going to go out there on your own, doing it your way, doing it the way that you think it should be done, it will come to naught. And so us who are preachers, us who are evangelists, which I think that's all of us, as we're called to do that, let's do that with the Lord. Let's do that on His terms, His way, and not our own. Yes, there are little ways of, it's not a cookie-cutter approach necessarily to the way you should do things, but it should be according to what God says and according to how God lays it out and what Jesus says is the right way to do it. Recognize that without Jesus and without His work, without Him, His blessing on our lives, we would have nothing, and that's what we would have to show for it. Jesus would ask us in our lives, do you have any fish? Have you been producing the fruit of the Spirit in your life and in the fruit in others' lives? And if not, maybe it's because you've been trying to do it on your own, by yourself, without Him.
I appreciate that point. I think Jesus basically says, at some point in our lives, we all should be able to figuratively hear that voice of the Lord saying, your efforts haven't gotten you very far, have they? And then we have to acknowledge that that's true, and then come to the conclusion that our efforts will continue to get us nothing unless we rely on Him. And that's exactly what the disciples see here. It's also striking to me that there are certain key things along the way here, especially in these post-resurrection appearances, that are like the signals that this is Jesus. We have Mary not recognizing Jesus until a few moments into their encounter. We have in Luke the men traveling to Emmaus who don't recognize Jesus until a certain part along the way, and And here we have these men not recognizing who Jesus is until something specific happens. And it's at that moment of realizing that he's the source of the catch. It's not just that some guy on the shore, had a bright idea of doing something and we got lucky. This is, he told us to do this and it happened. He's the source of what happened for us. That tells us who he is. And so we need to see those things at work in our lives. And too often we see, we see something great happen and wow, boy, I worked hard to get that, or I got lucky and that happened for me, or there's some force out there or something that has blessed me. But no, it was the Lord. The Lord is the one that is the source of those things, and we need to recognize the Lord's hand at work in the same way that they recognized that this was Jesus because of what happened. And that becomes that signal to us that then we can trust him further because we saw it happen. And now we can see the next step along the way that it's going to happen for us again, that Jesus is going to continue to bless. Okay. Section 1 down?
Yeah.
All right.
Sure.
Nice. Section 2, 9 through 14. So when they got out on the land, they saw a charcoal fire already laid and fish placed on it, and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish which you have now caught." Simon Peter went up and drew the net to land, full of large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples ventured to question him, "Who are you?" knowing that it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and the fish likewise. This is now the third time that Jesus was manifested to the disciples after he was raised from the dead.
So anyways, one thing that I did forget to say is that Simon Peter swam 100 yards or so, and I thought that was pretty, a great feat. Last time I went to the McPherson pool, I'm not sure how 100 yards is, but I think I can make it from one of the short sides, from where the dog slide is to the other side. Just swim across there. But by then, I'm pretty tired out. But anyways, he's known as maybe one of the more senior, more older gentlemen among the disciples. But he could still swim a long ways, which was pretty impressive. Anyways, so they got out. We'll skip that first point for just a second. But I thought it was interesting. When they get there, they see this fire in place with fish laid out on it and some bread. So Jesus already had fish there. He says, "Bring your fish, some of the fish you caught, to me." I've got mine already prepared up here. Bring yours, and he already had some on the fire. I think part of that is, this is such a great cast, this is such a great catch for these fishermen, but yet Jesus isn't dependent on them. Jesus isn't dependent on their fish. Jesus can still provide for himself and his people. And so sometimes we get a little bit too big for our britches, thinking it's all about me and how great I've done. As Jason was saying, we've caught, even if they could say, well, Jesus told us to do this, and we caught a whole bunch of fish, when they start thinking, oh yeah, we've got a great breakfast because we've caught all these fish, and it's going to be so good, I'm thinking of all this stuff that we can do with our catch, and yet Jesus is going to provide them something that was totally not in their pool of resources. Now that might be, again, a little bit of a stretch, but I think that it's a good point to make, is that when we start thinking that all of the success, about all of the things that we have to offer the Lord, that it's something that, oh, God needs my help, or God is just so reliant on me, or even the church is so reliant on me, and I am the one that's holding all this together, and I'm the one that's, I've got all of this stuff to offer to God, to offer Jesus, and I bring my bag full of fish to to Jesus' feet, and yet Jesus already has everything that I could offer. And so, again, while I'm not trying to say Jesus doesn't want your help or want you to bring everything that you have, it's not about our great works that we can do for Jesus. It's about how we can participate in the work that Jesus is already doing. Jesus is already providing for us and looking out for us. One of the things that I didn't put on the slide here was Jesus said, "Come and have breakfast." And now I don't know how many of you have your morning Bible study and some breakfast, but it's scripturally sanctioned right here. Breakfast with Jesus. Anyways, They had that was the highlight of their day. They got to have breakfast with Jesus. Make that the highlight of your day. Have breakfast with Jesus. Anyways, fun thing I wanted to say there. Again, it's funny that they numbered the fish. Now, this might have been because as fishermen, they wanted to know how much they'd have at market that day. You know, we got 153 in our boat. When we get to the market, we should still have 153, and every fish brings one, half a denarii or denarius. And so, we have 70 denarii now, or I don't know, again, I don't think fish were that much. A denarii was a whole day's wage. But somebody, they counted the fish, and it was 153 of them, which that's a lot of counting. I mean, that's a lot of fish. Now, granted, the word there is small little fish, and so, again, I don't know exactly how big that is, but it is definitely referenced as not large fish. It's not a fish that swallowed Jonah. It's not a large, huge tuna that they catch. On which we're at? Verse 11. Oh, it does, full of large fish. Well then, full of large fish. Well, it is chapter 8 that they have. There it is. I see the difference here. There are two kinds of fishies, and in verse 11, that's the large fish, and verse 9, I believe, is the small fish. So Jesus has Jesus has small fish. That's where, again, thank you for catching that. The large fish are in their net, and the small fish are in Jesus' net. Anyway, there is a difference between the fish that Jesus has, fish laid on it, and full of large fish, verse 11. And that's where, again, I apologize, I did misspeak. That verse 11 is the different word there, large fish. But the fish that laid out on it with bread and the fish that Jesus brings in verse, I believe, 13, is the small fish that he has. Little fish, big fish. There's two randomly different words there. But they have large fish in their net, but Jesus has little fish on the fire. So anyways, he have great breakfast with Jesus. They have 153 of these large fish. And one of the things, again, that just kind of, I guess, highlights the fact that John is trying to say, I know my fish, was the fact that he says the net was not torn. The fisherman, knows his craft, and there's a whole bunch of fish in there. And again, they are called large fish in verse 11. And so he's saying, man, our nets, they didn't break. And John recognizes this. I don't necessarily, I would call it, miraculous that this net didn't break. But this definitely was a miracle that Jesus caused all the fish to be there. And again, did he create fish in their net, or did he just group all the fish there and hold them until it was the right moment to bring them into the net? We don't know. I don't know how God works in mysterious ways. I know that they were there, and they made it into the net. And when they made it to the shore, the net wasn't torn. And maybe the miracle is that all the fish that showed up were nice and they swam with the net, and they didn't swim against the net. Who knows? I did use the word swum. I wanted to put that in there.
Swim, swim, swum.
Swim, swam.
Well, and I think too, going back to the idea that Jesus, without Jesus, they were blanked. They had nothing. With Jesus, they were blessed. But this goes to highlight that the blessing, it's not just a little blessing either. It's a great blessing. It's a blessing that they're not. This is not the typical catch. On a good night when they go out and they work all night, maybe 153 is a good night for them. But to get that many in one catch, that doesn't happen. And so Jesus blesses. I'm thinking of the passage. When he pours it out, it's shaken down, mashed together, and filled up to overflowing. And so we have to realize again that even when we're expecting blessing from the Lord, we often hinder what the Lord can do for us by putting too low of an expectation on what he can accomplish for us. And so we think too small. And the Lord is not bound by our thinking. And so we need to expect big things from the Lord. And not physical, not monetary, not superficial things, but spiritually speaking, we need to expect him to exceed our expectations and do more for us than we can possibly imagine.
So before we move on, and the reason why I saved this one for the end is because this is what leads into the next interchange between Jesus and Peter. The Greek has been very interesting. John has been throwing around lots of different words. The other word for large fish was ichthuon, and then little fish were upsaron, and so there's a little bit of a difference there between big fish, little fish, and bigger fish. Anyways, but
It's my favorite verse.
in John 21, verse 15, and I don't know if we'll get too far in there tonight, but what is about to happen is Jesus will have this interplay with Peter. The last time that this word anthrakion, and I put it up there in English, anthrakion, it's a fun word to say, especially when I have time to practice my pronunciation. Anyways, anthrakion, it is it's not a hapax legomena. Hapax legomena means it appears one time in the New Testament, a couple different words that show up a couple different times, like the word for propitiation, I believe it shows up 2 times, so it's not technically a one-time only word. It shows up 2 different times, one in James, and I think one in
Romans.
Romans, I think. Anyways, in 2 different, or maybe 3 different places that word shows up, and they translate it propitiation, and there's a little bit that goes in there. Anyways, this word is used 2 times. John chapter 18, and I believe that this is an intentional, if it's not necessarily something intentional of Jesus at this time, where Jesus was making a fire saying, oh, I'm going to make this fire because X, Y, and Z, and that's 100% could be the case. I don't know. I can't read Jesus' thoughts. But I do know that when John is writing this, he uses this word twice, and he uses it twice on purpose. There is a reason why authors do this. There's a reason why he is doing this. John chapter 18 and verse 18. It says, now the servants and the officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing there warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. The verse right before that, it says, the servant girl at the door said to Peter, you are not also one of these man's disciples. Again, one of those times when she uses the word that says, I know you are truly a disciple. Are you? He said, I am not. Now the servants made a charcoal fire. So it's used 2 times in the entire New Testament. It's used when Peter was standing before them saying, I am not one of this man's disciples. And again, I think it's another time when the denial is being reiterated, that he will say that's not the right way of putting it, but he will get more and more exaggerated in his denial of Jesus. And so Peter, and again, maybe charcoal fires were everywhere, and this is not something that Peter would have necessarily been super keyed in on, but as readers in John's gospel, we can key on the fact that Peter denied Jesus, and there was a charcoal fire. The last thing he smelled as he was denying Jesus, the last thing he was warming himself by, but when he denied Jesus, was a charcoal fire. This may be the next time that he's ever around one of these kind of fires in specifically. And so I don't know if Jesus was setting this up, again, specifically in the text at that moment to say, Peter, I 100% know the last time this was a part of your life. I know that this was something that you were experiencing when you were denying me, and I want to bring your mind back there. But John for sure is saying that because he's used the word 2 times. It's there and here, drawing our minds, at least as readers, back to the last time Simon was around one of these, and it was when he denied Jesus. And so Jesus setting the stage, saying, "Come and have a little breakfast with me." Around this fire that is going to remind you of the fact that you failed. Yeah. That there was a time, and again, Jesus had said, if you deny me before men, I will deny you before my Father. I don't think that Jesus is trying to dig at Peter and really, see, look at this, I know what you did. Sometimes we can be that way as humans. Of, well, I remember last time you did me wrong. It was when you were wearing that green shirt, Jason, and you're wearing the green shirt again. And don't you remember last time you wore that one? That was not very nice. I don't think Jesus was trying to just dig in at Peter and say, well, I'm trying to, really put you in your place and knock you down a peg. But I think he's trying to say, listen to the last time that you failed me. And yet the next interchange they're going to have is Jesus, again, restoring Peter.
Yeah.
And so Jesus was bringing his mind back there saying, you know what, in the midst of your failure, I am still a forgiving God. I am still a forgiving Lord. He's also God, but I will forgive you. And we'll get into some of that next week of why this is something that maybe Jesus and Peter didn't discuss in their one-on-one that it says in Luke 20, 23 and 24 that he had with Jesus after he rose. Well, why didn't they discuss this when he had his, and Jesus restate him then? And maybe they did, but this is specifically a public demonstration of Peter's loyalty to Jesus. 3 times you denied me, but 3 times I'm going to tell you I can still use you. And we'll get into some of that next week.
Yeah, I can. This is the passage I've been waiting to talk about for like since we started, that we're getting to next week. So I think it's one of the most beautiful pictures in all of Scripture is the reinstatement of Peter, and I think you're right that nothing that John records here is accidental, and so I think the whole setup to this, and we can talk about, we've done a lot of speculating on a lot of things over the last few months as we've talked about some of these things in depth, and I think we can speculate about some of the things that are going on with Peter, even the idea of him going back to fishing, and maybe he was choosing that not because he had given up on Jesus, but because he had given up on himself. And it was not, he didn't consider himself to be worthy or fit to be able to continue in the role that Jesus had placed him in before that. And so he was going back to a life that he felt was safe for him or was fitting for him because he had made the mistake of denying Jesus. And Jesus, I think, is going to do a great thing for Peter in the coming verses. So I think all of that is possible and plays into it. And we'll speculate more and not speculate as well. We'll have some conclusions next week about some of these things. But it's just, I think we can go into a lot of different directions with this and kind of chase some rabbits on those kind of things that are very interesting and very applicable to us. Because my goodness, we all need reinstated at various times, at various levels. So it's good for us to think about those things. Thank you.